In the early years of the 20th century, the blank spaces on the world's maps were shrinking fast, yet one continent remained a vast, white insult to human pride: Antarctica. It was unmapped, unconquered, and utterly indifferent. Ernest Shackleton had already tasted that insult once before. He had come within 100 miles of the South Pole, closer than anyone, before turning back to save his men. He returned, not defeated, but with a new conviction. This time he wouldn't just approach the continent, he would cross it, coast to coast, a single unbroken line drawn through the coldest, most hostile place on Earth. On paper, the plan looked clean, almost simple. One ship, the Endurance, would carry a shore party into the Weddell Sea on one side of the continent. They would land, unload their dogs and sledges, and begin a nearly 2,000-mile march across the polar plateau. On the far side, in the Ross Sea, a second ship would lay depots of food and fuel for the final leg of their journey, then wait to retrieve them. The crossing itself would be brutal, a test of human limits, but the logistics felt manageable. Shackleton believed he had what it took: leadership, preparation, and an unshakable resolve. The ship chosen for this monumental task was named Endurance. She wasn't built for speed, but for survival. Her hull was a fortress of wood, with some timbers over 4 feet thick. Her ribs were massive, her bow sloped, so that if ice squeezed her she would ride up and over it, rather than be crushed. She had already proven her strength in the Arctic. Her very name wasn't about defiance or conquest, but about the simple, stubborn ability to last. The crew was a mix of seasoned veterans and hopeful adventurers. Shackleton famously advertised for men, and the story goes that his ad read, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, low wages, bitter cold, long hours of complete darkness, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success." Whether the ad is real or not, it captures the spirit of the men who signed on. Shackleton chose his crew not just for their skills as sailors, scientists, or carpenters, but for their temperament. He understood something fundamental about the Antarctic. It didn't just break bodies with cold. It broke minds with boredom, frustration, and despair. A man who could endure months of crushing monotony without cracking was as valuable as an expert navigator. When the Endurance finally departed from England, there was ceremony, optimism, and a flurry of press attention. The world watched, a little skeptical but mostly full of admiration. This wasn't a mission of science or rescue. It was pure, unapologetic ambition. The ship pushed south, making a final stop at South Georgia, a rugged whaling station that was the last outpost of civilization before the true wilderness began. There, they heard troubling news. The whalers' men, who knew the southern ice better than anyone, warned them. The sea ice had formed earlier and was heavier than they had seen in years. It was a serious warning, one that should have given them pause. But Shackleton acknowledged it, and then quietly decided to press on. In his experience, hesitation could be just as fatal as recklessness. Ice always looks worse from the outside. A window of opportunity could open at any moment. He chose forward motion. Under deceptively calm skies, the Endurance entered the Weddell Sea. At first, the ice was scattered. Large, lazy floes drifted in the dark water, and the ship threaded her way between them with ease. The mood on board was electric with excitement. The crew took photographs. They joked. They felt the thrill of the journey truly beginning. Antarctica was no longer just a name on a map. Its immense ice cliffs rose on the horizon, distant but real. But as the days passed, the scene changed. The open water leads narrowed. The scattered floes began to press together, moving not as individual pieces, but as a single, cohesive mass. The temperature plummeted. The light flattened, stripping the landscape of all depth and perspective. What had seemed like a puzzle was becoming a wall. The ship's progress slowed to a crawl. The engines would strain, reverse, then surge forward again, trying to shoulder a path through the thickening pack. The men stood long watchers, their eyes scanning constantly for any crack, any weakness in the ice wide enough to slip through. Still, there was no panic. This was what the Endurance was built for. This was part of the challenge. The crew trusted the ship, and above all, they trusted Shackleton. Every delay felt temporary. The ice began to speak. It made deep, groaning sounds that traveled right through the wooden hull and into the bones of the men on board. But the ship held firm, rising and settling as the pressure ebbed and flowed. Then, one morning, the motion simply stopped. The engines pushed, but the ship didn't move. The water around them had turned into a thick, slushy porridge that held them fast. The ice had tightened its grip. It wasn't a violent attack. It was a slow, deliberate embrace. The small leads that had offered a path forward the day before were gone, squeezed shut by an invisible, relentless force. They waited. They waited for the tide, for the wind, for the natural breathing of the vast ice pack to reopen a path. It never came. Instead, the pressure grew. The Endurance was no longer a ship sailing through the ice. She was now a part of the ice, drifting wherever it took her. The crew marked their position every day, and watched in dismay as the drift carried them not south toward their landing site, but west and north, away from their goal. The continent wasn't just blocking their path, it was carrying them away on a journey of its own. Shackleton, ever the pragmatist, adjusted. The plan to cross the continent was quietly put on hold. New routines were established for a long winter trapped in the ice. Supplies were then tried. Life became a matter of disciplined waiting. The universal belief was that when spring came, the ice would break up and the ship would be freed. The Endurance would endure, but the sounds grew louder. The groans from the ice became shrieks. The pressure no longer eased, it was constant. The ship's massive timbers began to complain. Beams flexed and bowed. The entire vessel would be lifted several feet out of the water by the squeezing floes, only to be dropped again with a shuddering jolt. Shackleton listened. He had learned to trust the instincts forged in the brutal cold of his previous expedition. Something was wrong. This wasn't normal pack ice. It was thicker, older, and it wasn't breaking apart. It was compacting, folding in on itself, becoming stronger. Winter was not retreating. It was closing in around them like a fist. The confident optimism that had launched the expedition didn't vanish in a single moment. It slowly eroded, replaced by a quiet, watchful tension. Men slept a little lighter. Conversations grew a little softer. The ship, once their vehicle of ambition, was starting to feel like a fragile shelter that might not last. And still, the ice continued its work slowly, methodically, and relentlessly, beginning the long, agonizing process of deciding the Endurance's fate. The pressure didn't announce itself with any kind of drama. It came the way winter arrives in the polar regions, slowly at first, then all at once. The ice around the ship, the Endurance, began to thicken until the line between sea and solid simply disappeared. What had once been separate, floating plates of ice became a single, locked surface, a solid white sheet stretching all the way to the horizon. The ship was no longer drifting freely. She was trapped, embedded in the ice. At first, this felt like something they could survive. After all, other ships had managed to overwinter in the polar ice before. The men adjusted to this new reality of being completely stuck. They fell into routines designed to keep their minds sane. Every day, they cleared ice from the deck, chipped paths along the ship's rails, and checked rigging that they wouldn't be using for months. The dogs were taken out for exercise on the vast ice floes. Scientific observations continued as planned. Meals were served at regular, predictable hours. The expedition leader, Ernest Shackleton, knew that order wasn't just a suggestion, was their primary defense against the crushing isolation. But underneath this veneer of routine, the ship was under constant, relentless assault. The entire pack of ice moved like a single, massive organism, responding to distant winds and invisible ocean currents. When pressure built up miles away, it traveled silently through the frozen mass until it found the weakest point. And sometimes, that weakest point was the Endurance herself. The sounds were deeply unsettling. It would start with a low groan, originating somewhere deep within the ice, followed by a vibration that shot up right through the hull. The whole ship would shudder, its timbers flexing under a kind of stress they were built to withstand, but not forever. Men would pause in the middle of a task, listening, waiting to see if the sound would fade back into silence or escalate into something far worse. At night, the noises grew louder. The intense cold sharpened everything. The temperature dropped far below anything most of the crew had ever experienced. Your breath would crystallize the moment it left your lips. Frost crept along the inside walls of the ship, blooming like a strange white mold. Ink froze in its wells. Touching bare metal would burn your skin. The Endurance became both their refuge and their biggest liability, a wooden structure, fighting against forces that never got tired. Shackleton watched the ship's behavior with intense focus. He noted how she would rise slightly when the ice squeezed her, how her hull would bend without cracking, and how, sometimes, the pressure would ease up, just as unexpectedly as it had arrived. These brief moments of relief fueled their hope. If the ship could just hold on until spring, the ice would loosen its grip. The sea would be able to breathe again. The Endurance would live up to her powerful name. Then came the first undeniable warning. A sharp crack echoed through the hull, a sound of wood splitting under extreme strain. It wasn't catastrophic, but its message was crystal clear. This was no longer a theoretical risk. Real damage was happening. The ship's carpenter was immediately summoned. Beams were inspected. Extra supports were added wherever they could be. The pumps were checked obsessively. The men worked with a controlled, but undeniable, sense of urgency. The ice, of course, didn't care. The pressure events became more frequent and more violent. The ship was lifted several feet as massive ice floes forced themselves underneath her, levering her upwards. Then, without any warning, she would drop again, crashing back down into a hollow created by the shifting ice. Every single one of these movements loosened something, a seam. It was then that Shackleton made the decision that marked the true turning point of the expedition. Supplies were brought up from the holds below and organized on the deck. The lifeboats were readied. Sledges were prepared for travel. This was no longer just a plan for a potential emergency. It was preparation for losing the ship. He knew the Endurance might not survive the winter. Still, he didn't give the order to abandon her. Not yet. Leaving the ship meant stepping out fully into the raw Antarctic environment, committing to a life on the ice with no shelter beyond tents and whatever they could improvise. As long as the Endurance remained afloat, even damaged, she was still safer than the great unknown of the ice pack. The men could feel the shift in atmosphere. They began to pack their personal items carefully, selecting only what could be carried if they had to leave in a hurry. Diaries, photographs, small comforts, little things that connected them to the lives they had left, far, far away. There was very little talk about failure. That word had no practical use for them now. The only question that mattered was how long the ship could hold on. The answer arrived suddenly. In late October, the ice converged with a final, decisive force. The pressure was immense. You could hear it before you could see it. The floes heaved and buckled, piling up against the ship's sides. The Endurance was lifted violently, her bow rising as if it were trying to escape into the air. The hull twisted grotesquely. Beams cracked in rapid succession. Then, water began to pour in. This was no longer just damage, this was destruction. The pumps were manned immediately, but it was a futile effort. The water was rushing in faster than they could pump it out. The ship's structure had been compromised beyond any hope of repair. Shackleton didn't hesitate. The order was given. Abandon ship. What followed was controlled chaos. The men moved quickly but deliberately, passing supplies from hand to hand across the treacherous ice. The boats were lowered and dragged to a safe distance. The dogs were secured. Scientific instruments were salvaged wherever possible. There was no screaming, no panic. Their discipline held strong, even as the terrible reality settled in. Their home was dying right beneath their feet. The Endurance continued to break apart as they worked. The pressure didn't ease up once the hull was breached. It actually intensified, as if the ice sensed its victory. The ship's sides bowed inward, her decks warped. The sound was relentless splintering wood, tearing metal, and the surge of freezing water. Eventually, there was nothing more to save. The men stood on the ice and watched as the Endurance was slowly, methodically crushed out of existence. She didn't sink cleanly. She was squeezed upward, her frame folding in on itself, her masts tilting at impossible angles. For hours, she resisted, half afloat, half destroyed. Then, finally, the sea claimed her. She slipped beneath the ice, stern first, disappearing into the black water that closed quickly over her. The name Endurance, painted on her stern, was the last thing to go, the letters sliding below the surface, leaving nothing behind but broken ice and a profound silence. No one spoke for a long time. The loss wasn't just material. The ship had been their certainty. She had been the plan. With her gone, the expedition was transformed completely. There would be no crossing of the continent, no rendezvous on the far coast, no return home according to schedule or expectation. There were now a group of men standing on a drifting sheet of ice, hundreds of miles from help, with the Antarctic winter tightening its grip all around them. Shackleton gathered them together and spoke calmly. The goal, he told them, was no longer exploration. It was survival. Every single decision from this moment forward would serve that one purpose. There would be no heroics, no unnecessary risks. They would wait. The ice beneath their feet continued to drift, carrying them northward at the whim of forces they could neither see nor control. Their entire world had narrowed to their tents, their dwindling supplies, and each other. The expedition hadn't ended, it had just entered its most dangerous phase. With the Endurance gone, time itself changed. Hours stretched into an eternity, and days blurred into one another. The men learned to measure their progress not in miles, but in calories consumed and morale preserved. The ice beneath them was both their ground and their transport. An unstable continent drifting north, whether they wanted it to or not. Shackleton named their first camp with a deliberate simplicity, as if clarity itself was a form of shelter. Life on the ice had begun. They built routines immediately. Tents were arranged with care, spaced to blunt the wind's attack. Supplies were inventoried again and again, the numbers becoming a mantra. Fuel was guarded like treasure. Food was rationed with a restraint that hinted at a future none of them dared to imagine. Shackleton insisted on regular, hot meals whenever possible. He knew warmth was as much a psychological comfort as it was a physical necessity. The dogs were always fed first, their daily exercise a reminder of motion in a world that had otherwise stopped. The men took turns cooking, hunting seals, and maintaining the camp. Every task mattered, every job gave shape to the endless days. Without this structure, the ice would claim more than just their fingers, and toes it would hollow them out from the inside. The ice floe they lived on was never still. Cracks appeared without warning, sometimes with a sharp crack that sent men scrambling from their tents. Leads of open water formed, then slammed shut again as if the ice were breathing. The camp had to be moved more than once. Tents dragged across rough surfaces, supplies hauled on sledges over ridges that felt like frozen waves. Shackleton watched everything, constantly. He slept lightly, his ears tuned to the sounds that signaled danger. When pressure built in the ice, he acted early, never waiting for certainty. Better to move 10 times for nothing than once too late. The men trusted his instinct. It had already saved them. As the weeks passed, the reality of their situation settled deeper. They weren't just stranded, they were adrift. The floe carried them steadily north, but it wasn't carrying them toward safety. Their position was tracked daily, the calculations made with a grim precision. Even if they reached open water, they would still be hundreds of miles from any land where rescue was even a remote possibility. Morale became the invisible battlefield, and Shackleton understood this better than any navigation problem. He rotated tent assignments to stop cliques from forming. He staged small celebrations for birthdays and holidays, insisting on ceremony even when supplies were thin. Music was encouraged, stories were told, and laughter, even when it was forced, was never discouraged. But the strain showed in small ways. Irritations flared over nothing. Silences lingered a little too long. Men would stare into the white distance, their eyes seeing nothing at all. The monotony of white and grey pressed against the mind as relentlessly as the cold pressed against the skin. The ice dictated the terms of their survival without malice. As winter deepened, temperatures plummeted. Darkness stretched longer each day until the sun barely rose above the horizon. In its absence, their world shrank to the small circle of lantern light around the camp. Outside that glow was an endless, silent, frozen void. Hunting became essential. Seals and the occasional penguin provided fresh meat, a vital defense against scurvy and weakness. The act itself was grim, but necessary. Shackleton framed it as a duty, not as violence. Survival required decisions stripped of all sentiment. The dogs, once symbols of future travel and hope, became a more complicated presence. Feeding them consumed precious resources they couldn't spare. The decision to reduce their numbers was made quietly and carried out without discussion. It was one of many choices that weighed heavily on every man, but it was one that could not be avoided. Every life taken was measured against the lives that remained. Spring brought light, but it didn't bring freedom. The ice didn't loosen its grip as they had hoped. Instead, it fragmented unevenly, turning their solid flow into a dangerous, shifting maze. Travel became harder, not easier. The surface buckled and fractured, demanding constant vigilance. One misstep could mean a plunge into icy water and a death that would come in minutes. Shackleton faced the next decision with the same clarity he had shown from the beginning. Waiting indefinitely was no longer an option. The ice would eventually break apart completely, scattering them into the sea. They needed to reach land in Elanby for that happened. Elephant Island emerged as the most realistic, if terrifying, option. It was barren and uninhabited, but it was solid ground. It lay far to the north, beyond the drifting ice, reachable only by boat once they found open water. The journey would be brutal, but staying where they were meant a slow, certain dissolution. The lifeboats were prepared again, this time not as a contingency, but as their only lifeline. Repairs were made with an ingenuity born of pure desperation. Canvas was reinforced, and rations were repacked for a journey by sea. Everything that was not absolutely essential was abandoned on the ice. When the floe finally broke beneath them, it did so with decisive, terrifying force. The cracks widened into channels. The ice separated into moving fragments, grinding against each other with a deafening roar. Tents were struck in a flurry of activity. The boats were launched amid chaos and freezing spray. Men leaped across widening gaps, hauling supplies, pulling each other to safety. The transition from ice to sea was violent and utterly exhausting. They fought for every mile, rowing through slush and waves, navigating between colliding chunks of ice as big as houses. Sleep came in stolen moments. Hands grew permanently numb. Faces cracked and bled in the relentless cold wind. After days that blurred together into a haze of pain and effort, they reached Elephant Island. It wasn't salvation. It was simply not ice. They landed on a narrow strip of rock and shingle, with waves crashing relentlessly and sheer cliffs rising behind them. There was no shelter, no vegetation, no sign that a human had ever set foot there before. But the ground did not move beneath their feet, and for the first time in 497 days, that was enough. They dragged the boats ashore and collapsed where they stood. They had survived, but survival had only brought them here. It had not solved the problem of rescue. That burden now pressed heavier than ever, and Shackleton knew that waiting, once again, was not an option. Elephant Island was not a sanctuary. Elephant Island was not a sanctuary. It was just solid ground, and the men of the Endurance expedition learned its harsh truths within hours of landing. The beach they claimed was a sliver of land, constantly under assault by a surf that threw chunks of ice ashore like stones from a slingshot. Above them, sheer cliffs shed snow and rock without warning. The wind was a constant, screaming force, whipping across the island and carrying sea spray that froze instantly on whatever it touched. There was no soil to dig into for shelter, no wood for a fire, and no life besides the seals and birds that clung desperately to the desolate rock. But it was land, and for the first time in months, land meant a real decision could be made. Ernest Shackleton, their leader, refused to let false hope take root. He knew Elephant Island was miles away from any shipping lane. No one was going to stumble upon them by accident. To simply wait here would be a death sentence, just as it would have been on the melting ice floe. Rescue wasn't going to find them. They had to go and get it. The crew dragged the remaining lifeboats higher up the beach and began the work of turning them into a makeshift shelter. They flipped one boat, the Stankenwills, upside down and propped it up with stones, creating a low, dark refuge. It was barely tall enough to sit up inside. The men crammed together, shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in their perpetually damp sleeping bags, listening to the relentless wind battering the hull just inches above their heads. It was a miserable existence, but it was survivable for a time. Shackleton's eyes were fixed on the boats. He studied them with an intense focus. Of the three, only one, the James Caird, had any chance of making a long open-sea journey. The crew began to modify it, with an almost obsessive attention to detail. They reinforced the planks and painstakingly sealed every seam with a concoction of oil paint, seal blood, and anything else they could find that might keep the ferocious ocean out. They built a makeshift deck to help shed the massive waves, leaving only a small opening where the crew could crawl inside to steer or bail water. Their destination was South Georgia, an island over 800 miles away, across some of the most violent and unpredictable seas on the entire planet. It was a gamble so extreme, so utterly audacious, that few would have even considered it rational. But Shackleton didn't frame it as an act of heroism. He presented it as a stark necessity. He then chose the men who would go with him. He didn't pick the strongest, but the most resilient, the ones who could function under constant, mind-numbing cold, exhaustion, and fear. The ones who wouldn't crack under the immense pressure and silence of the open ocean. He left the rest of the crew, including those whose health was failing, under the command of Frank Wild, the man he trusted most to maintain discipline and, crucially, hope in his absence. The farewell was brief and stark. There were no grand speeches, no attempts to soften the brutal reality of their situation. Every single man understood the odds. They knew what was being attempted, and they knew what failure would mean. Hands were shaken, quiet promises were made, and then, the James Caird was launched into a churning grey sea that looked eager to swallow it whole. From the very first moment, the journey was an unrelenting nightmare. Waves rose like moving mountains, crashing over the bow and freezing instantly on contact, coating the boat and the men in a sheath of ice. The small vessel pitched and rolled violently, often at angles that felt impossible to recover from. The men bailed constantly, their hands raw and bleeding, their muscles screaming in protest. Sleep was a luxury, snatched in tiny increments of just a few minutes, curled up in waterlogged sleeping bags that never provided any real warmth. Navigation was a daily battle. One small miscalculation, 1 degree off course, and they would miss South Georgia entirely, doomed to drift into the vast emptiness of the South Atlantic, where there were no second chances. Shackleton depended on brief, rare glimpses of the sun, taking readings with a sextant held in numb, frozen fingers, while the boat bucked and lurched beneath him. Each successful reading felt like a small miracle. The days blurred into one long, continuous ordeal of pain and effort. Their food rations were cut to the bare minimum: biscuits, scraps of seal meat, and the occasional hot drink made from melted sea ice when their precious fuel allowed. The men's bodies began to shrink inside their heavy, sodden clothing. Their faces grew gaunt, their beards caked with ice. Yet the boat kept moving, pushed forward by a current of pure, stubborn will, as much as by its small sail and oars. When the cliffs of South Georgia finally appeared on the horizon, it didn't feel like a triumphant victory. It was more like exhaustion taking physical form. The cliffs rose steep and unforgiving from the sea, battered by a ferocious surf that made landing on the side they'd approached impossible. The island was real, but it was not welcoming. They were forced to find a landing spot on the remote, uninhabited far side of the island. The James Caird, battered and barely holding together, could go no farther. Shackleton now faced another seemingly impossible decision. The whaling station, and their only hope of rescue, was on the other side of the island. To reach it, he would have to cross South Georgia's uncharted interior, on foot over glaciated mountains no one had ever traversed. Without maps, proper climbing equipment, or any rest, he didn't hesitate for long. Leaving 3 men with the boat, Shackleton set out with 2 of his companions, Tom Crean and Frank Worsley. They began climbing immediately, moving upwards through deep snow and over treacherous ice that hid deadly crevasses beneath its smooth, white surface. They slid down steep slopes on improvised ropes made from their boat's painter-crossed, knife-edge ridges where one misstep meant vanishing forever, and pushed forward relentlessly, knowing that to stop for rest would mean freezing to death in their sleep. For 36 straight hours, they moved almost without pause. The island fought them at every turn with steep climbs, sudden drops, and weather that shifted from calm to blizzard in minutes. Their bodies were operating far beyond any normal human limits, driven solely by the cold, hard understanding that stopping was not an option. Then, as they finally began their descent towards the whaling station at Stromness, a sound reached them. It was a faint alien noise that grew stronger. It was the sound of human industry, the sound of life, continuing on, completely unaware of how close extinction had come to intersecting it. Their arrival was so shocking, their appearance so haggard and otherworldly, that the whalers who first saw them barely recognized them as human beings. But the rescue was not immediate. The ordeal wasn't over. Attempts to get a ship back to Elephant Island were beaten back again and again by impenetrable sea ice and violent storms. Weeks turned into a month, then more. On that desolate beach, the men Shackleton had left behind waited. They scanned the horizon, listened to the ceaseless wind, and survived on a diet of dwindling rations and sheer belief. Then, at long last, a ship broke through the ice. When Shackleton stepped onto the beach of Elephant Island for the final time, he didn't speak. He just counted. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 22. Every man was there. All had survived. The impossible had been achieved. The ordeal was not truly over. Its memory would endure for a lifetime, but the fight for survival had been won. Silence followed the rescue in a way none of them expected. The sudden return to warmth, food, and human noise did not bring immediate relief. It brought disorientation. After months of listening only to wind, ice, and the slow creak of survival, ordinary sounds felt intrusive. Words came slowly. Some men slept for days. Others couldn't sleep at all. Shackleton stayed with his crew as long as he could, watching for signs that the ice had not finished its work inside them. Physically, they recovered faster than expected. Mentally, the process was uneven. There was no language yet for what they had endured, no framework for trauma, no expectation that survival itself could leave wounds. The world they returned to was already changing. The war that had seemed distant when they sailed south now consumed everything. Their story, astonishing by any standard, was received quietly. Newspapers reported it. Briefly, there were no parades, no sweeping celebrations. The Endurance had vanished beneath the ice without witnesses, and for decades it would remain there untouched, unconfirmed, a legend suspended somewhere between fact and disbelief. The men dispersed. Some returned to the sea. Some never did. A few struggled to adapt to lives that no longer required constant vigilance. Others carried Antarctica with them quietly, letting it surface only in fragments, habits that never left, silences that lingered too long, eyes that always seemed to be measuring the weather. Shackleton himself did not settle. He spoke often of returning south, of unfinished business with the ice. He framed the expedition not as a failure, but as proof of something rarer than success, that leadership, under the worst conditions imaginable, could preserve life without sacrificing humanity. Yet the pull of the polar regions never released him. Years passed, expeditions continued elsewhere, technology advanced. The world forgot the precise details of what had happened in the Weddell Sea. The ice closed over Endurance's resting place, preserving her in darkness so complete that decay itself slowed to a crawl. Wood did not rot. The ship waited. More than a century later, she was found. There was no wreckage field, no scattered debris. Endurance lay upright on the seabed, intact, as if set down gently rather than destroyed. Her name was still visible on the stern. The wheel remained in place. The damage that had ended her was frozen in time, pressure marks locked into wood that had not known warmth since the day it disappeared. The discovery did not rewrite the story. It confirmed it. Everything the men had said, the way the ship had resisted, the manner in which she had finally yielded, was etched into her hull. The ice had not sunk her violently. It had squeezed her, patiently and completely, just as they had described. What endured was not the vessel itself, but the decisions made after she was lost. Shackleton's legacy does not rest on crossing a continent or planting a flag. It rests on a series of refusals to abandon men, to prioritize glory over survival, to pretend conditions were better than they were. Each refusal narrowed his options. Each one saved lives. The story is often called impossible, but that word misses the point. Nothing supernatural occurred. No miracle intervened. What happened unfolded through discipline, adaptability, and an unglamorous commitment to keeping everyone alive, even when success meant simply lasting another day. Endurance was crushed by ice. The expedition's purpose vanished with her. Yet what remained? Leadership under pressure, cooperation without illusion, survival without spectacle, proved more durable than any ship. The ice closed again after the rescue, erasing tracks, smoothing scars. Antarctica returned to silence. But beneath that silence, one ship rested untouched, and one story waited, proof that sometimes the greatest achievement is not reaching the destination, but bringing everyone home.